Now, you are here as part of the John Warwick Montgomery Annual Apologetics Lecture. We started this last year, and John Warwick Montgomery himself, what is an 8 decades an octogenarian, a 9 decades a nonagenarian. Yes. That's how all language started. And a nonagenarian who has basically seen to this lecture. He is providing us his library, and in return for getting his library, we're doing lectures in his honors. And so this is our annual lecture. And this gentleman to my left, Craig Parton, is not only a lawyer, but he is one of the teachers at the Strasberg Institute, where apologetics and other human rights issues are dealt with as part of John Warwick Montgomery's ongoing work there. He is a trial lawyer by trade, which is what I do, except he does it on what we call the other side of the V. Defense. So while I'm representing widows and orphans, he's trying to rip them off. And
big oil.
No.
Somebody needs to keep you honest.
Somebody's got to pay us. And we love
lost
him.
a lot of money to this man.
No. He's an outstanding man of God. He is an outstanding lawyer for God, and he applies his trade in so many valuable ways. Would you join me in welcoming Craig Parton? God bless you and what you do. And next to him is Kristen Davis. Now, I've just met Kristen today. She is the founder of Doubtless Faith Ministries, and she's working on trying to take apologetics. Now, apologetics, generally, there's a Greek word behind it as well, but ours is probably more tied to the Latin apologia, which means a defense of sorts, and words of defense maybe is a better way to see it. But she is someone who is taking apologetics on the mission field and has a real heart for making sure people in other countries think through issues about the existence of God. She's an adjunct professor of apologetics at what used to be Houston Baptist University, but as of 2 weeks ago is now Houston Christian University. They have changed their names. She is a PhD candidate in philosophy of religion at Southern Evangelical Seminary, and her dissertation is fascinating. It is on the intersection between artificial intelligence and the existence of God. So would you join me in welcoming Kristen Davis? Next, Darrell Bock. Now, Darrell Bock is a senior research professor in New Testament at Dallas Theological Seminary. He is a very serious New Testament scholar. And he is someone who, if you get far along at all, y'all grab any seat you want, and except right up here. We've got some here, and hey, y'all, on the sides, there's tons of good seats too. So whatever. No. Yeah, here. Those are. Yeah, we saved those for you. And so, you bet. Anyway, he has authored or edited more than 30 books. So this fella is a scholar of great renown. He's got his PhD from the University of Aberdeen. He was a Humboldt scholar at the University of Tübingen, and on the board of Wheaton. Been married to Sally for over 40 years.
47. I want credit for every one of them.
And so does she.
I do divorce work also. Starting there.
And we are just really delighted. Would you join me that Darrell's taken time out to do this with us? And next is my buddy Charlie Stiles. Now, Charlie, I got to know because he is the chief executive officer of OCCA. OCCA, O-C-C-A. That's the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. And yeah, that's Miss Carolyn. She'll applaud if she likes it. If she doesn't, she'll come talk to you afterwards. The Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, and he comes there having already spent 15 years as a curate and rector, which is British speak for he was in the ministry, and pastored and did things like that. He's got a delightful accent. It's his first time to Texas. He came over just to do this. He got in at 1 a.m. yesterday morning on location, and yesterday evening, Becky and I had the privilege of taking him to Cavender's Boot City, where we got to see him outfitted with cowboy boots, a cowboy hat, a cowboy belt, a cowboy buckle, some proper boot jeans, and a snap, snap, snap cowboy shirt. And I'm telling you, when he walks off the plane, his wife and children are not going to know what hit him. But would you join me in giving a giddy-up welcome to Charlie? And knowing that the last will be first and the first will be last, we have Craig Evans carrying that end of the table. Craig, many of you know, he is a distinguished professor out at what is now Houston Christian University. He's a very prolific author. He's a very serious scholar. He spent 35 years teaching in Canada, has dual citizenship, and so he can say "a" at the end of his sentences if you want him to, speaking Canadian, or he can do whatever.
To speak English.
He is every student's favorite Bible professor. And would you join me in welcoming him and thanking him for being here? Okay, so I have a list of questions that I've thought that I'd like to ask these panelists about. And we're going to try and do it in some semblance of order. If you've got questions as well, we'll see if we've got time for them, but figure that you're here for the next at least hour and a half. And if you can make it that long, great. If not, restrooms are in the building right outside. And just be as inconspicuous as possible as you leave. And I'll try to draw attention to you. So I've got my first question. And my first question is, I want to know how you came to faith. Because each of you are believing Christians, and I think that might be an instructive place so that as I ask you these other questions, everyone will have a frame of reference of how you came to where you are. So, Craig, how did you come to faith?
I was raised in a Christian Science home for 18 years, never took an aspirin, never went to a doctor. Family was totally committed to Mary Baker Eddy. And then my dad died my senior year in high school, and I went to college pretty much adrift. Ended up in freshman dorm where some Navigator Christian Ministry people, seniors, decided to be resident advisors in order to evangelize freshman students. And I came in contact with the gospel there. And apologetics. I always thought I had the greatest questions in the world until I realized that Christianity had produced some of the greatest intellects in history who had answered all those questions and even more. And so I was brought into the faith through apologetics. I immediately was told, you share your faith with other people, you do free speech, what have you, and ended up on staff with what was then called Campus Crusade for Christ, but they dropped that like you dropped the Baptist. That was a joke. So I was going to Texas where everyone's a Baptist, goes to a Baptist church, and everyone's dropping the Baptist part of it. But I spent 7 years on staff with Crusade, debating and doing classroom materials, lectures on reliability of the New Testament, and then went into law practice from there. So I've been practicing in Santa Barbara at a firm for the same firm for 35 years. Yeah, 5.
That's great. Thank you, Craig. Kristen, tell us about how you came to faith, please.
Yeah, so I was raised in church and Christian school, but I was raised probably in a more nominal Christian home. We didn't really translate what we caught on Sunday morning into the way we lived our lives. And so I was a Christian because it was the most exclusive. I remember standing in my grandparents' living room after watching some Discovery Channel thing on different faiths and thinking, well, Christianity is the most exclusive. I have to be good and believe in Jesus, so I'll probably be good enough for whatever religion is actually true if I'm wrong. Didn't have a whole lot of staying power. So when I went away to college, I ended up falling away from the faith. I had really liked my Bible classes, but I had been advised by my parents to get a secular degree where I could support myself and then I could study whatever I wanted. So I ended up falling away when I went to a public university, and not because anybody challenged my faith, but just because it wasn't a whole lot of fun to not do the things all my friends were doing. And of course, that led down a terrible path where my life ended up falling apart. But in God's divine providence, I ended up getting a job that turned into, or an internship that turned into a full-time job. And I thought, now I want to study the stuff I wanted to study in school. So I went to Liberty and took a variety of things, but a biblical archaeology class and creation science class. And between those two classes, I realized all these questions that I had no idea that I even had got answered. And so I became convinced that the Bible is actually true. And so if the historical and scientific things can be trusted, then maybe the theological and more difficult things to believe can be trusted as well. And so that started a journey for me where I was like, I had as much Jesus as you could possibly get, and I still missed the boat. Why is this stuff that we're studying in seminary not getting out? And that was the beginning of my ministry career. So.
All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Kristen. Darrell, how did you come to faith?
Well, my parents were Jewish and left Judaism right before I was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which meant that they were isolated. We grew up in a nominally Christian church, but my mom got cancer when I was 8 years old, passed away 6 years later. And my dad was a businessman, so I really didn't grow up in a Christian home. So by the time I was high school, I would have self-identified as an atheist or an agnostic, take your pick. I knew what I wasn't a believer. And I had several people share with me through high school, and I had a Christian roommate, potluck roommate at SMU my freshman year who lived out their faith. And it seemed like everywhere I turned, I would run into a Christian who wanted to share Christ with me. And eventually the Lord, over what was a 5-year period, drew me to himself, came to the Lord, and started a Bible study my sophomore year at the University of Texas at Austin, a fine Christian school. And we started with 6, my roommate and I, and by the senior year, we were packing a 4-bedroom apartment for people to study the Bible together. Went to seminary and been there. So I'm actually the audience for your book in terms of who I was, and so I also understand what it is to think like a non-believer, which has proved to be extremely beneficial to me in ministry.
All right, and I'm going to be eager to hear. Each of you are laying the foundation for the next few questions, and you all, I know the questions coming. So the way you've laid the foundation, I'm pumped to ask you all the questions, but I want to get everybody's foundation first. So Charlie, I know your story, but I'd like you to tell everybody else your story.
So I think I would say my faith journey began with praying grandparents. So the first
praying grandparents.
Praying grandparents. So my grandparents, they weren't all born into Christian homes themselves. Some of them had come to faith in later life. But I remember the first time I took my fiance to go and meet my grandparents, and my grandma took Sophie in her arms and said, "It's so great to finally meet you. We've been praying for you since before you were born." That as soon as they had children, they started praying for their grandchildren, and they started praying for their grandchildren's spouses, knowing that they would be the most significant people in their lives. And so I think I trace my spiritual journey back to then. And so I grew up in a home that knew and loved Jesus. I remember my grandfather teaching me the song, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." And yet I grew up with all sorts of different questions, and I suppose I could tell a long version, but some of them were intellectual. And what was great was that questions were encouraged. They're not just allowed, but encouraged. And so I'd come back from something at school or from some event that I'd gone to, and I'd come back just full of questions. And my parents would listen, would help me work them through, would recommend reading, put some other people in my life that were really just so helpful for me as I was exploring those kind of intellectual questions about the world. But even at that point, where I think intellectually I was kind of convinced, and every time I was pushing the door of doubt, God would just reinforce kind of intellectually what his truth was. There was then a gap, I think, between how I lived my life, the decisions I made and what I wanted to do with my life, and yet what I knew to be true. There was a kind of a gap in the will. And so even though I would say I believed in God, so much actually of my day-to-day level, particularly my Friday and Saturday nights, I was a practical atheist. And it was during my first term at university, where I'd gone up, fired up, I'm going to tell everybody about Jesus, and I'm going to do amazing things, where God brought me face to face with the true reality of my condition without his grace, my desperate need and the depths of my own sin. And after a night of self-pity, kind of gave me this real sense of rebirth and this kind of emotional and holistic connection with all that I'd been taught as I grew up.
Fantastic. Thank you. Craig, tell us about how you came to faith.
It was, I'll back up to a few years before I was born. In 1949, the American Baptists went through a split. And it was the conservative Baptists were reacting to the idea that if you were a missionary, you did not have to believe in the divinity of Christ. And my grandparents and my parents who were engaged made, in my view, the right decision. It wasn't enough to be a Baptist, you actually had to be a believer. And so, and of course I look at that, like, that was a huge thing, because I then grew up in a church where the gospel was preached. That wouldn't have happened had they decided to, because I shouldn't say it wouldn't happen, God is sovereign, but in any case, I wasn't even 10 years old yet, and I responded, and I remember to this day a great sense of conviction that the gospel was true. And as on into high school and beyond, then I wanted to put that to the test and think through it. I didn't want to believe something that hadn't been thought through. I realized later in reading C.S. Lewis, it was a lot similar to his mindset that way. And so I've always been interested in apologetics, especially, and I hope I have a chance to say something about that later in the panel, about how important evidence is and logic, because we're in a time now where those things are not always appreciated. So that was the context in which I responded in faith. Later was baptized, so it turned out I was both a Baptist and a Christian, and I have clung to that conviction. And I'll tell you this now, this has been decades now, and I continue to pursue the scripture in its full context, the history of Jesus and Christian origins in full context. I'm up to my eyeballs, and I pray God gives my brain 10 more good years so I can get some things finished. But I have seen no evidence that would suggest the Christian message is false. I've seen no evidence that the Gospels are fictions, that Jesus didn't say and do the things that the Gospels say he did. Perhaps some of this will come up later. So I've been a Christian for many years, and convictions are stronger than ever.
That's wonderful. So one time I had an opportunity a few years back I was at Wheaton College and speaking at various things. And a professor there named Jerry Root was teaching a class, and he asked me if I'd teach his class that day. And I'm sure a lot of y'all know Jerry. Great guy, great guy. And I said, I'd love to, not knowing what the class was. I said, what's the class? And he said, I have a class teaching students how to share their faith. And I said, okay. I said, anything particular you want me to teach? He said, whatever you think. I said, how many students? 43. I said, wait a minute. Are there 43 students paying Wheaton tuition to learn how to share their faith? Because, I mean, like, they come to Pastor Jarrett's sermons on Sunday morning and get that for free. And he said, yeah. And I thought, how cool is this? 43 students so committed to their faith that they would pay tuition to learn how to best share it. So I went in to teach the class, and I took 43 sheets of paper, and I passed them out so that everybody had the same sheet of paper. And I said, here is what I want you to do. Take a pen. You're going to write something that I tell you to write on this sheet of paper. And then you're going to fold it in half, and you're going to come put it in this trash can. That's an empty trash can. And nobody will know. Don't sign it. Nobody will know what you wrote. I don't know who you are. I don't know your names. I don't know your handwriting. And I will read these, but then I will destroy them. So no one will ever know you have complete anonymity. Everybody got it? Yes. I said, so here's what I want you to do. I want you who are taking a class on how to share your faith to write down your biggest personal struggle for believing. What is it that is the biggest obstacle that you confront for believing that your faith is real? And I want to see what it is. And so they did it. And I got those sheets of paper and did my Evelyn Wood speed reading. Some of you are old enough to know what that is. And I started putting them in stacks to try to filter them. And 70 to 75% all fell into one category. And then the rest filtered among several other categories. Now, I don't give any of you anonymity, but you're old enough not to need it. And so here is my question to you, and then I'll come back to my story at the end. My question to you is, what has been historically, as you go back through your life, what has been your biggest challenge that has challenged your brain and made you wonder, is this all for real? Is there really a God? What is it in your brain that has caused you to examine that issue and really try to come to grips with it and try to come to grips with real answers for it? I know that's asking you to maybe for some of you go way back in your memory, but I trust you can go way back in your memory. And I think it would be a big benefit to everyone because we're all walking the walk with you. So I started with Craig last time. Well, actually, we've got Craig's on both sides. Yeah, this is Craig land. So let's start at Craig Evans' side this time, and we'll work back to Craig Parton. So Craig, how old are you, if you don't mind me asking?
70.
70 years. What in 7 decades has been the argument that you've thought, I gotta answer this, or I gotta deal with this. This is worthy of my brain cells. Is there something you could share with us?
Yeah, I think so. One of the reasons why I pursued biblical scholarship was because the question I had in my teens and 20s was, is the Bible trustworthy? And so your question is more challenging to me now, because after 50 years of serious Bible study, my answer to that is, well, yes, it is actually. And I find a lot of skepticism on the part of the skeptics, the atheists, the agnostics, the objectors, and so on. It's almost always it's based on ignorance. They wouldn't say that if they actually knew the field properly. So if I have a challenge now, having moved beyond that, it's the disappointment in Christendom itself, and so it's a problem of good, problem of evil type question. And why aren't Christians better at it than they are? Why isn't the church better at it than it is? I mean, there's the Lord of the church. He has disciples, We are empowered by His Spirit, and yet there is so much failure, embarrassment, hypocrisy, sin, if you will, criminality. Of course, I'm cherry picking things, and that's what I remind myself. Well, wait a minute. There are so many unsung heroes. Rarely do you get a headline that says, guy does the right thing and has been doing it consistently all his life. That's never a headline. But you get one pastor that messes up big time, or a priest or somebody, then that is a headline and they beat it to death. So I try to put that into context. But I have to say, that's the one thing that disappoints me. Maybe I'm a little too hard on Christendom, and I know we're works in progress. But there are some unbelievers in my general family, in-laws, that kind of thing, and that's what they will raise, that kind of objection.
Yeah, it is a common one. It was also one that was raised by the Wheaton students. That was not the 75%er, but it was a definite pile. And it causes me to, this is my buddy Louis Migori. Louis, come here. Come stand up right here, brother. I've known Louis for most of my time in Houston for at least 35 years, or 30 to 35 years. Louis plays the guitar, and you played the guitar since high school. You were in a high school band, right?
Yes.
All right, get the mic up there. Let's go ahead and tell everybody. You played it since high school.
I've played the guitar since high school.
Okay. And do we have a little better mic for him? It's not picking up. Can you play Stairway to Heaven, the lead intro?
Yes, Call to Worship, Stairway to Heaven.
He's from Wharton, Texas. That's a joke. And so can you play it as good as Jimmy Page from Led Zeppelin?
No.
Okay, thank you. Go sit down. So I can play the intro to Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven too, but I ain't no Jimmy Page. So do I blame Jimmy Page if I can't play it good? No, not his fault. I mean, he wrote it, but I'm not good at expressing it always. I buzz some strings. I don't have the flow. I don't have the fill in the blank. So I don't know that it's fair to judge Christ and Christianity off the way I'm living it or someone else is either. I'm trying to get better. I'm practicing. That's sort of my response to people who come up with that. Do you have another response you could give us? Is there another way to handle those people who say, well, why would I believe in God? You're all a bunch of hypocrites.
I've been giving that a lot of thought because people will often bring up, Bart Ehrman does that. And I've known Bart, by the way, since Princeton days in the 80s. I've known him a long time. And gets back to me once in a while. He'll say to somebody, Craig's okay. I don't think he hates me. I think he actually cares about me. So I'm really happy to hear that. Because to hear, Bart will say that people hate him or wish that he was dead or something like that. And I sure hope that's not true, that people are thinking that or expressing that. But he likes to bring up the question, the problem of evil or bad stuff. And what I'm having fun thinking about it. I'm not a professional philosopher. I minored in philosophy as an undergraduate, so that's it. But I can read the literature, and most of the subjects I do get pretty well. I'm not an ethicist exactly either, but I'm having fun thinking about the problem of good. I think you need to put the shoe on the other foot, because when the atheist or the objector talks about whether it's the failings of Christians in the church or the problems in the world, there's a hidden, assumed ideal. And that's because it is God's world. He made the rules and we're made in his image. And so when an atheist complains that things aren't really good, that's because there's a benchmark inside them that recognizes that that's not right. So I want to put the shoe on the other foot and say, let's talk about the problem of good. Because if your worldview is correct and it's only the law of the jungle and it's just kill or be killed or blah, 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 that usual thing, then why is there so much good? Why is there beauty? Why do we appreciate it? Why do we strive to be moral people? As you say in your book, there are atheists and agnostics that are nice people. Why? So it's pushing the burden of proof where I think it ought to go onto these other shoulders. So that's one way I think about this problem. And so I don't want to be overwhelmed by the negative headlines that really don't represent the whole picture.
That's great. Thank you so much. Charlie, let's shift to you. What is, in your history and in your life, what has been the biggest challenge to your faith, and how did you live through it and work through it?
Yeah, thank you so much. It is, I suppose, a broader question and then a specific example. I think it is that when people don't believe, particularly those who have walked and have believed and seem to have put their faith in Jesus, who then drift away. So I think of a very close friend who was a genuine and deep believer, and of course had his doubts like all of us, and yet turned his back on Jesus. It was somebody very close to me, so it was something that was relational, emotional. It was something in my life. But here's somebody who I love, and I know that God loves, and yet they don't love God anymore, and that's really hard. And it's intellectually, I can come up with all sorts of arguments for it. I think I've got a pretty good doctrine of sin, and I think I understand that it's not as simple as just, as somebody just, believes the right things and ticks the boxes. And I know that there are decisions of the will that we have to make in our lives, and sometimes God puts before us a choice, and that's a genuine choice, even in the sovereignty of God. But for me, that's been a really deeply sort of personal thing that's happened actually with a couple of different people, but there's one particular in my mind as I say that.
So how have you worked through that struggle? And maybe it's something that you still work through today. I don't know, but I mean, how? We live in. Okay, time out. I don't know how many of you watch British TV, but it's very different than American TV. In American TV, you can have this entire crisis, and within 40 minutes, it is resolved, and everybody lives happily ever after. In British TV, they'll kill the main character midway through the episode. They've got absolutely no compunctions about it. So in American TV, you would now say, but everybody lived happily ever after, so-and-so and so-and-so came to faith, and da-da-da-da-da, and it was wonderful, and God put a bow on it, and now we're all happy. But this is not American TV, this is real life. And so I know that there are people in here who struggle with that same problem. And as not just the CEO of ACA, but also as someone with a pastor's heart who's pastored a church for a long time, would you please tell us how you handle that intellectually and emotionally?
Thank you. Yes, so I think intellectually there are reasons why, and often actually in people's specific stories it's not normally the same thing. Sometimes it is an event that happens in their lives and actually you realize that their faith wasn't as strong as you thought it was. Sometimes it is, as one of my friends at Ocker puts it, it's a war of loves. And at least for now, it seems that the other love is winning over the love of God, and someone's drawn elsewhere. I think I felt, though, with this, and I do even now, where do you take the problem? Do you try and fix it? Do you try and answer it? Do you try and evangelize that person more? If I just talk to them more, if I convince them, if I really just lean on them with every kind of bit of persuasive technique, if I just read more apologetics books and show them what's right, or do I take it to the one who is sovereign even over the human heart? And so for me, I think it's been something that's led me to my knees in prayer, and many others in the friendship group too. It is something that's changed the way that I preach. I can't preach about the judgment of God and about the last day now without weeping, sometimes even in the pulpit, but certainly as I prepare. It's brought it home to me in a new way. And so I can see even God using this really difficult situation, this real sadness in my life, for good. It's given me a greater love for those who are lost. And it's maybe take the problem to God. And just finally, it's not wrapped up in one episode, but the story isn't over yet.
Amen.
I hate it when plaintiffs' lawyers lean over the rail like that. Don't let him do that.
Amen. The story's not over yet. The story's not over yet. I lean on that truth. There is a wonderful Hebrew word. Oh, by the way, I get to add all of this because technically I'm a panelist as well today. So this is me being a panelist / moderator. So if you want me to shut up, sorry.
Who moderates the moderator?
God. Okay. Actually, Becky's seated right over here. Yeah. My wife is right here. And there's a wonderful Hebrew word, shuv. Shuv. And if you're reading through the minor prophets, Amos in chapter 4 and 5, over and over, Amos says, the Lord declares, I stripped away your food. I sent famine. I sent mold. I sent all of these different things. And each time it's to shuv, to make you turn your heart back to me. And Israel doesn't turn. They don't turn. And God says, so I sent this to make you turn. I sent this to make you turn. I sent this to make you turn. And then at the end of those passages, he says, so here's the deal. That's a Lubbock translation of the Hebrew. Here's the deal. You're going to meet me, the God who formed mountains and now walks on them. You're going to meet me. You may not have turned to meet me, but I'm going to find you because you're my heart. And it is a love story. And God tries to turn us. And if we don't turn, he just jumps to the direction we're going. You don't avoid him. He's going to meet us somewhere. The story's not over. I like that. Okay, Darrell. Biggest challenge to your faith. Speak to us. Historically, you don't have to say today, but just what was an issue in your life that you had?
One of the things that you've done here is you put two New Testament people up on this panel. So Greg and I have worked side by side together for decades. And the problems that we have worked on have been very, very similar. But let me introduce another one other than the one that he introduced, which is probably the biggest thing that I've been wrestling with ever, is the trustworthiness of Scripture. But let me bring in another one. It's the reality of pain. And you've alluded to it a little bit with the shuv, but we have tried to anesthetize ourselves to the presence of pain in the world. We do not cope with the fallenness of the world very well. And so I find myself thinking through how do you deal with someone who goes through pain? So I'll personalize this. I lost my mother at the age of 14. I lost my father to a heart attack at the age of 21. So I spent this time when I was an atheist agnostic trying to make sense out of what was going on around me in terms of having lost two parents and finding myself in college with no parents around, depending on my brothers and sisters, which was a blessing, but maybe not the best. And wrestling with the presence of pain in life. And I think I'm typical of the person who doesn't have Christ, which is they're looking for location in life. I tell people that one of the challenges I think the church has today, living in the pluralistic world that we do with all the sounds that are coming at us from every direction, is that we want to start the gospel in Genesis 3 and we need to start the gospel in Genesis 1. And what I mean by that is that if we don't understand who we are made to be as human beings and why God made us and what God made us for, then the story of sin kind of can get lost in terms of what it is that the gospel is supposed to restore us to, because we've started in the wrong place. It is profoundly important that every human being who walks the earth is made in the image of God. That is location, to think through real estate. And with that location, the rest of life makes sense and has order, because that's what Genesis 1 is all about, giving order to chaos in the creation. So for me, the answer to pain is, yes, it's the outflow of Genesis 3, but I don't want to lose in the outflow of Genesis 3 where Genesis 1 starts us and where the gospel as good news, the gospel's good news, it's not bad news, wants to take us. So no, the story's not done on the one hand, but it also is designed to reconnect us to the way that we were made. And so for me, and this is the bottom line, it took me a while to get there. To me, the more important thing for people to appreciate is how God desires a relationship with them versus anything else. And that relational base impacts everything I do in ministry as I reach out to someone who may not know him. So for me, the bottom line in doing apologetics isn't what I may know about the Bible or all the historical stuff I can bring or all the intellectual stuff I can bring. It's the tone of God's heart. And so I simplify John 3:16 this way. God so loved the world that he gave. Just think about that for a second. And if I can do that well in the way in which I live my life, if I can reflect if I can image God in the way that I do my life with that as a focus point, many of the things that get us into trouble as Christians will go away, and there will at least be less relational pain in the world. That is my ultimate apologetic.
Yeah, thank you. Darrell could have helped figure out how we painted this chapel. So because we've got new faces, I'll tell you this is a replica of a church that was built in Cappadocia around 500 AD. And at that point, illiteracy was really high. And so you've got a church, the Roman Empire has fallen, at least in the Western areas. You've got a church that is functionally illiterate among the laity, among the people. And the question that they didn't realize the full extent of was, how do you teach theology, doctrine, faith to people who won't have a Bible for 1,000 years, and if they had one, they couldn't read it? And the answer was using every tool possible. So creeds rose up in greater number because it was an easy way to remember basic theology. But even their church buildings were built to teach. And so the first thing you build, like with this building, is the foundation. And you'll notice this chapel's built in the shape of the cross, because the foundation of the church is the cross. But when it came to painting the chapel, we start right there, and we start with Genesis 1, because we've got Adam created but held in the hands of God. God shaped Adam. God fashioned Adam. God was Adam's breath. The intimacy was of the greatest level. And so it begins a relationship, but you'll notice the next panel is Adam naming animals. Genesis 1, God names everything, but man is in his image, so man gets to name in Genesis 2. And then woman as well from his side is his equal there. And then you've got the serpent. And if you look at the serpent, we had to figure out how to paint the fruit. And I didn't want to paint apples because I love apples. They get a bad rap. Hebrew says fruit, it doesn't say apples. It doesn't say plums. I don't like mangoes. I thought about painting mangoes. But I stole from C.S. Lewis and I painted it with tears. I had it painted with tears because tears are beautiful, but they're also painful. And they reflect the pain that came in through that to us. But we are remiss if we don't journey through the cross and see at the very end of the church, and the screen blocks it for most of you, but at the very end of the church is Jesus, and underneath is a passage from the end of Revelation. Idou skene to theou, metaton anthropon kai skenose met auton. It says, behold, or look at, in Lubbock, look at, the dwelling of God is with men of people, and he will dwell with them. And that's the love story. The love story of the cross is the solution to pain, is the answer to the lost intimacy, is the pursuit of God. And the greatest example is John 3:16, which is the cross itself. So amen to you. We need to get you on speaker for that, or on film for the chapel tour. Kristen, what was your biggest challenge to faith?
I think mine was wondering if I was crazy. Struggling with whether or not this really is true. Most of the people in my life, especially the people I care about most, are nominal Christians, if they are even that. And so I'm kind of an outsider in those communities. And so sometimes it's very hard to understand or to be confident that this thing that I have based my entire life on that makes me so different from the community around me, that it really is true, because they seem to be living just fine without it. They seem to be suffering less than maybe people who are Christians and going through less difficult circumstances. And so it's definitely been something that I wrestled with. I've never been the type of person to believe something because someone told me to. And so those were my initial questions that brought me to the faith. Was this book, it's written by a bunch of men. How do I know that they didn't just make it up? And so that's really where the biblical archaeology and the creation science questions came for me, because there's some really unbelievable stuff in this book. That a man would come, or God would come and become a man and die for me, that could count for me. That's unbelievable. And so if there are things in the book that are true, that I can know are true, that changed everything for me, because then that Jesus died on the cross in 33-ish AD and by the Romans, all of those things are historically verifiable bits of information. And if those can be credited, then the fact that it's theologically true, that it counts for me, that I can believe. But apart from the coupling of that with historical foundation, I really wrestled with the ability to believe that. And it's funny because I tell people I do apologetics selfishly. I do it for my own faith, because it has saved my faith so many times. When things get difficult and bad things happen, I start to wonder, am I just making this whole thing up? Am I crazy? I go back to the arguments and I've said, you've spent 15 years studying this stuff. You are convinced it's true. Don't let the way you feel today be the grounding for the decisions that you make. And so it's really been a very personal walk in knowing that I can trust the evidence and the unbelievable things.
Thank you for being so transparent, and God bless you, because that allows you to help so many people who are no doubt struggling with the same issues. All right, lawyer.
Skip me.
No. Come to us. Talk to us.
Well, I think the most difficult issue for me coming into the faith was the reliability of the text that presented this situation that I was in with sin, and the complete total rescue that the cross is the great example of that. When I was at my worst, he bent down and to a repentant soul and saved me. How could I have confidence that was transmitted to us reliably? And I spent a lot of time on the topic of, are the New Testament Gospels reliable? Because if you answer that question affirmatively, and they are, It's like a grease skid from there down to the case for Christ. If the Gospels are reliable, if they're the best story, news report we have of the life and work of Jesus Christ, then you can take the next step from there. How is Jesus presented in this reliable book? He's presented as God in the flesh. How does he verify that, or does he? A lot of people can say they're God. He verifies it by his resurrection from the dead. This position, this religious position, asks to be falsified. It cries out to be analyzed and refuted, and lawyers have done this in effort to do this for centuries, and have in the process become Christians themselves. So the case is absolutely solid. It can be established, but the initial premise that the New Testament Gospels reliably have come to us and give us an accurate picture of who Jesus is critical. From there, you establish the case for Christianity. Since then, I think my most difficult question is what Luther said you'll break your neck on. And since I'm a Lutheran amongst Baptists, I'll share this with you. Luther said, God desires all men to be saved. That's scriptural. He desires all to be saved and none to be lost. Second point, only God does the saving. From stem to stern, he gives you the faith to believe. It's by grace alone, period. What do you contribute to salvation? Yes, you do. You contribute your sin. Cheer up. So if that's the case, why are any lost? And Luther said, you'll break your neck on that. Get off of the subject, go to the cross of Christ where there's forgiveness to all mankind offered, and there you'll find your comfort. Be a Christocentric theologian and apologist. All you do should be centered on the person and work of Christ. But that theological question you'll break your neck on.
And yet that just makes me want to break my neck. So let's work our way through that. Darrell, why don't you start?
I want to piggyback on something that Craig's raised. I don't think the church realizes, because of 2,000 years of pretty good Christian PR, how difficult the assignment is of what we're asking of people.
Keep looking that way.
We are asking of people. Yeah, I'm just trying to check and see.
I got your back.
He's behind you now.
Yeah, I don't trust you one whit.
I got
Anyway,
your back.
There you go. That's my client. Make him be out in front of us, Your Honor. I want him in front. I don't know what's going on back here.
Yeah, I read your book and saw what you did in the courtroom. That makes me very nervous.
All right,
Okay.
I'll sit out here.
So, I forgot where I was. The church is asked to tell people who do not have a church background that there is the most unique human being who's ever walked the earth. There's only one Jesus. There's only one person who has combined full-blown divinity and humanity. That means that he is totally exceptional in terms of who he is. So you are climbing uphill from the start with someone who is not a believer. And I see apologetics as creating categories for people that they currently don't have. If you want me to define what apologetics is, that's it. I'm asking someone to take steps, theologically or otherwise, into spaces that they currently are not equipped to step into. How do I do that? That's the challenge. And even when I think about God, and we talked about salvation as if it's a sequence, right? But think about God for a second. Does he have sequence? Does he even have sequence? I mean, he can function in sequence, but does he have sequence? I am forced to rely on who he is for what it is that he has done. Okay? And And even to conceive that question, I don't mean to break my neck. I'm trying to put it in a, what do you call those things?
Collar.
Collar, yeah. I'm trying to put my neck in a collar so I don't break it. When I ask that question, all of a sudden I realize that if God is who he claims to be, what is, and has been, and will be, and he has taken into account in doing that everything that could be taken into account, and you end up where you ended up, which is, I better trust in the story that he gives us, because even though he's the only human being who's walked that way ever in his earth, that's also the only story in town that can make sense out of what's around us.
That's good.
Amen.
That's good.
Charlie, yeah.
So we tend at Ocker to play a certain sort of bingo, and basically you either end up quoting C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien. So I'm going to do Tolkien now. There's this great moment where Frodo and Sam are they're on their way to Mordor, and it's awful. And there's a bit where they're just looking forward, and it seems hopeless, and they're looking back, and actually it's not full of joy, and they want to give up. And there's this great bit that Sam sort of says, and they do it very well in the movie, where so it says, I reckon all the best stories, there was a time actually where the hero wanted to give up. And what you really notice in Lord of the Rings, now one of the most astonishingly popular stories, is all the time behind it, there's always the author. And actually throughout the books, they refer to this plan. Gandalf is sent back, you don't know why, you're never told who does it. We are part of the story. We are in the book. We cannot understand the author's intention, but he is carrying it out. And so when I think we are embarking on this impossible task of seeking to explain things that seem incomprehensible to people who are spiritually blind, we're not doing it alone. Mm-hmm. Actually, we're characters in the story, and God is the author. And he has the plan, and he knows the end from the beginning, and we really don't. And there are times actually where we do sit. And I thought, Kristen, how eloquently you put that issue, wondering if I'm crazy. Mm-hmm. I think that is for many people, particularly in a world that is becoming increasingly either secularized, or where the biggest group that's growing in society are the nuns, not the women in habits, but the people who are not affiliated to any religion. It's very easy to think, is this just something from the past? Is this stuff that used to be relevant is no longer relevant? And there are times actually you want to give up. And the great thing is that the story's not over, and it's being written by the author.
I'll come to your end. If you're gonna quote Tolkien, just so you've been fair, I'll reference C.S. Lewis. Chronicles of Narnia, do you remember reading, I think it's The Silver Chair, but I could be wrong. The one where the kids are, in essence, under the ground, in an underground
Silver Chair.
It's Silver Chair. And they're trying to come to grips with reality, and all the people in the underground subterranean area know they've been beguiled by the witch into thinking that that's reality. And the kids come in and they say, no, there's a place above the ground. And they're like, right. And the witch is, you're crazy. He says, no. And there's a sun, and it shines, and it gives warmth and light, as opposed to these lamps. And the witch is like, right, this sun, and where does it hang from? Well, it's just in the sky. Oh, so there's just this light that just hangs mysteriously and doesn't hang from anything at all. And you expect us to believe that. You think that we're crazy, and who's really the crazy one? And the competing stories that are there, when we, the reader, know that the real sanity and the truth is actually opposite of what the witch is portraying. But if you were sitting there just listening to the witch, you would think maybe, and the kids start thinking, man, maybe we are not remembering it right. Maybe we are a bit crazy. Maybe we are a bit, but to try to come to grips with that story. Okay, Darrell, you read my book.
We had to. That was the deal.
This is another lawyer's trick. You realize this, okay? All right. I want you to come speak, but you got to read my book before you can come speak.
Well, I also know enough to know that maybe nobody else did but you. So I'm not going to press anybody on this. Where do you think I've made they sent us questions. I would not ask this on my own. Darrell sent this question: which reason for belief in the book seems to you most important? And I think maybe out of fairness, which one do you hate? Where did I miss the boat?
Well, I'm not sure. I do have a note somewhere in here about the issue of the problem of suffering and seeing it from the standpoint of the person who suffers, rather than as a mere intellectual exercise. What I did is on page 108 of your book, just so I can be specific, counselor.
And it's not like I can change it at this
And
point.
that's exactly right.
So be
So on
gentle.
page 108, when you've got this weighing of the evidence, there are three in the middle that I think are really important. Uniquely valuing humans, human dignity and honor, and the importance of justice and fairness. I called if we're just a collection of chemicals, I call that your sack of potatoes argument. If we're not human beings, then we're a sack of potatoes. Okay? Life doesn't make any sense, and we're just here, and we're here for a while, and we're disposable, just like a sack of potatoes. So, what those three things have their hands all over is this relational element that's at the core of how we are made. I like to tell people, how many of you ever been to the First Baptist Church of Dolphins, or the Second Presbyterian Church of Bears, or the Third Methodist Church of Fish? There are things in the creation that don't contemplate reality the way we do, because we reflect the image of God. And in the midst of reflecting on the image of God, this what I consider to be relational ethics is really important. And then for me, what's important in apologetics isn't just what I believe and the rationality behind what I believe, although I think that's important. But as an unbeliever, when someone talked to me, the one thing I didn't want to talk about was Jesus and sin. So all of a sudden I developed this terrific compassion as an atheist agnostic for Africans. And I would ask the question, whenever someone got close to me with Jesus when I was an unbeliever, I would ask the question, so what about the heathen in Africa? Okay, and I discovered that Christians were like starving lions. You asked that question, it was like throwing meat out there, and they went and chased it. And now we were no longer talking about Jesus and me. We were talking about something else. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that I don't think we work hard enough at trying to understand where the other person who's not a believer is coming from and why. And if we would do that, we would do a better job of wrestling with how do I build bridges to the gap that God fills. Because remember, we're creating categories that people don't have. And we're also filling gaps in people's understanding of reality. And so thinking through how to do that. So I say, I pay attention to the arts. We've used Tolkien and we've used Lewis here. I pay attention to the arts. I pay attention to the arts coming from unbelievers because I'm asking, what are they searching for and what are they wrestling with? How's the gospel speak into that space? And if you listen to this is the last thing I'll say, but if you listen to the testimony of most people who came to faith who did not grow up in a Christian home, they met a Christian who lived out an authentic faith. And their testimony inevitably, halfway through or so, it says, I met so-and-so, and they worked with me or whatever, and I saw an authentic Christian. I saw his life or her life was different. And I began to ask why. And so sometimes I think we need to talk less and show more. And think through, this is why hypocrisy was so important to Jesus. Hypocrisy was so important to Jesus because there were people claiming to represent God who were not representing him well and were throwing people off in the process. So my answer to the problem in the church that Craig was worried about earlier about, I share his same concern about how the church is doing the church's call. Because when the church misses on the church's call, it misrepresents God. And that's serious. So our best apologetic is to be the relational people we are called to be. And that means putting us back in touch with the great commandment. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love God. Love your neighbor as yourself. The two are connected. It's one command. I can't talk about loving God and not care about my neighbor. And the second part of it is that I'm told who to love. And I'm not told to love just the people who love me. Jesus said the world does that. What makes us exceptional is loving our enemies. And we've got to figure out how to do that well.
So I've had, and I'm dying to ask Kristen you a question in a minute, but I've got to digress for a minute. I've been having a text chain with a fella.
A sex change?
Text.
Sorry.
I didn't hear that.
T-E-X-T. Text. See, this is why he's a lawyer on the other side of the V.
I'll do anything to divert.
Yeah, I've been having a text chain going back and forth with a fella who I consider to have extreme vitriol over certain issues that are political issues. And he texted me the other day asking me to help fund one of his efforts. And I was blunt and I said, no, I can't do that because I'm not going to put money that's associated with such vitriol and where name calling, accusations. I'm not going to do that. I said, I don't agree with other people, but I'm trying to love them into the Lord, not spend time and money embarrassing or indicting them for being, godless communists or something like that. And his reply to me that I got a couple of days ago was, well, I've already prayed for them. They didn't change. So now I'm using the Psalms to pray that God will destroy them and I'm going to be the arm of God. Comment, please. How do I respond to that?
We already responded to that. We responded with John 3:16. God so loved the world. God so loved the world. The world. Think about what the world is when that passage is saying that. That he gave. And so, the way I sometimes respond to this conversation that's happening in our public square is to say, who is it that Jesus was the hardest with? Pharisees. Why? They misrepresented God. Who's it that Jesus was the most generous with? Sinners. Why? He was wooing them. He was wooing them to the idea that God cares about them to prepare his son to die for their sin. There's a wonderful passage in 1 Peter 3:13 and following. We all know the passage if you know apologetics because it says, set Christ apart in your heart. Be prepared to set Christ apart in your heart. Give it offense for the hope that is in you. Okay, everyone memorizes that part of the verse. They don't pay attention to two things that are in the territory of that verse. The first is that it goes on to say, do it with meekness and respect, with gentleness and respect. The two Greek words communicate tone. And the second thing that it does later on is, why do we do it this way? We do it this way because we replicate, in doing it this way, the way God has handled us when our backs were turned to God. And so you're never supposed to forget where you come from as you share the gospel. And you never are supposed to forget how you got to where you are because of the gospel. And if you remember those two things, that God tapped me on the back when my back was turned, and that God, the only reason I have a life is because God has given it to me. If I will remember those two things, and remember that I was once in the place of sitting with the person I'm having the conversation with, and God was gracious to me, then maybe I should be gracious to them.
Amen. Thank you. All right, so as we get toward the end, here's where I'd like to go next. Kristen, I'm going to talk to you, and then I'm going to bounce to Craig, Charlie, and Craig, and we're going to go international. All right, now Darrell has just set the stage for us here in the U.S., but Kristen, you've got a heart for the nations, and I'd like you to express where your drive for that is and where you see the best role into the future. What is it? What's driving you? And then Craig, I need you to go back to your Canadian roots and tell us about where faith is in Canada and what are the problems and where you see it going. Charlie, I need you to do the same thing with the United Kingdom over in Great Britain. And then Craig, you're going to have to pull France in because you're the closest thing we got. Okay? Now I could get, we've got a missionary for a dozen plus years, 20 years from France sitting on the front row. So don't mess up.
Great cuisine, terrible politics.
Okay. Very good. So would you set our international stage for us, Kristen? Tell us about your heart, your ministry, and what's out there and what's important.
Yeah, I actually never thought I would be doing missions. I remember sitting in a hermeneutics class in seminary, and the professor was telling all of the guys, it's mission week. Make sure that your girlfriend is interested in missions if you're called to missions, because you won't be going if she isn't. And I thought, note to self, don't date a guy who's interested in missions. And so tell God your plans, right? And so fast forward, in my seminary program, a friend of mine asked me if I'd be willing to go to South Africa with her. She wanted to help with Ratio Christi in South Africa, but she didn't want to go by herself. And so I went with her, and we actually got to help speak at a variety of different churches. We just kind of caravanned around for 10 days on the radio, at colleges, and at churches all over the place. And what we found out was that there is a massive hunger for apologetics outside of the Western culture. But they don't have the access to it in the same way that we do here. There are a lot of countries out there whose cost of living index is so much lower than that in the United States that they can't necessarily afford to go to any of the online programs that we have and are able to take advantage of here. They have difficulty getting the books that we so readily have available to us. And they basically have the options of what they can find online, YouTube and whatnot. And so what I ended up finding out was that there is just such a massive hunger there that I wanted to be a part of the solution. And so I am co-founding in a ministry called Apologetics on Missions. We're in the middle of a name change. It was Adventurous Apologetics, but that's really our desire, is to go to people groups around the world and create self-sustaining apologetic communities in these places all around the world. And so going in and within 3 to 5 years, helping a local Bible college or seminary have their own apologetics program. So partnering with the great schools that are doing it here to help those communities come on board. And so we do missions work, go on trips. We see ourselves as catalytic, and so we bring together summits of apologetically minded people in those communities, because we don't want them to be dependent upon us here in the West. We want them to be able to do this on their own, because statistics are showing us that the bulk of Christianity is moving to the Southern Hemisphere and east. And so in the future, the largest of Christendom will probably be in Africa or South America. And so we're trying to get ahead of that and help them not go through some of the same struggles that we are. Apologetics is something that's rising up now in the West, but it's coming as a response to a lot of people falling away from the church. And right now in those areas, especially in Africa, there is a lot of people who call themselves Christians, And so we want to help strengthen and bolster their faith before they ingest too much of our Western secularism and follow us down the same path. And so we're a very young ministry, but we're super excited to be able to help people around the world. And so, yeah.
And before we bounce to the others, how could, other than praying for your ministry, what are other ways people could help?
Yeah, we consider ourselves Catholics. So we have a couple of different ways. We actually go on mission trips. So if you're apologetically minded, you have training in any way, and you don't want to go build a house or medical missions, you want to use your skills, you can come on a mission trip with us. You can also, we do online training, virtual training in between, because obviously you can't fully equip people in a weekend or a week. So we are always looking for teachers who want to help supplement that. And then also, if you would love to give us a gift, you're more than welcome to do that. We're in a fundraising campaign right now as well. So.
All right. Thank you so much, Kristen. So, Craig, talk to us about Canada. What is the status of faith? Is there faith outside of Regent College?
A little bit, yes. You need to know Canada is very secular compared to the United States. Jenny and I and our young daughters moved to Canada in 1980. And we were there 35 years. And what surprised us is that Canada is not like the United States. And it isn't just because they say A or something like that, but it's the evangelical population in Canada is very small. There is no Bible Belt. The government and most agencies, including police departments, are aggressively secular. It's not good to be a Christian. If you are, keep it to yourself. If you espouse your faith, talk about it too much, or get into evangelism or something like that, you run the risk of being considered intolerant. And tolerance is the religion in Canada, tolerance. And to be intolerant, and it's easy to be accused of being intolerant, even being accused of hate. And so it's dangerous to talk about certain things, including their hate laws. If I were to get up and preach a sermon and talk about, say, the moral code in Scripture, touching on sexual purity and activities and things like that, and someone hears me and uses what I said as a justification for committing a violent crime, I'm in trouble too. So that has a way of muting and silencing. So it's noticeably different in preaching. So that's the difference. Canada is far more like Europe than it is like the United States. And I think that surprises Americans. They don't know that.
Is there what would you give as the reason why? Is it an agnostic state? Is it
Mark, that's a great question. I don't know if anyone can answer that. If you go back to about the turn of the previous century, from the 19th century to the 20th century, Canada and the United States were almost identical as far as evangelical population and percentage, which was a majority. Why evangelical Christianity has declined so steeply in Canada, I think is a mystery. It's a mystery to me, and I've not heard anybody explain why that is so. It just is a fact.
Wow. All right, Charlie, talk to us about the UK.
Yes, so we like to do it differently, and I suppose it's been interesting just being over a few days, and I think particularly in terms of some of the ways we look about apologetics, and we think particularly the richness of the kind of culture and some of the provision going over here. The largest group, as I mentioned earlier, of people are those with no religious affiliation. And so, for instance, and I just jotted down a few statistics, back in 1983, that was 31%. 2018, it was 52%. Just a couple of years ago, it was 55%. So nearly double in 40 years. And that's the reality of the situation we're in, where people are disconnected from perhaps a lot of what they believed in the past. However, as has been demonstrated by a number of people, and if you've heard of Tom Holland, a book called Dominion, a lot of the assumptions in the culture are Christian. And so there's a real kind of Christian sort of philosophy, worldview, that undergirds a lot of our politics, a lot of our justice system, And yet people aren't really aware of where it comes from. They just kind of assume that these are things that are self-evident to all without any basis. And so what you're finding is you find that the public space is increasingly so-called secular, with an assumption that secular means neutral. And therefore, you could then have diversity agendas, which seeks to allow religious people to participate and speak into it, but in a kind of niche way. But, and I think this is probably quite significant, perhaps particularly for you over in the United States, because you're probably only a few decades behind us, and again, the largest group in the States that's growing are the unaffiliated. What we're finding is that now in a kind of post-Christian situation, people are now more open to talking about faith. So the Evangelical Alliance in the UK recently did a survey, and what they did was they went and spoke to somebody who didn't believe. And after a conversation with a Christian, they then asked them, how interested would you be in another conversation? 7 years ago, they found, to their surprise and encouragement, that 1 in 5 of the people that they spoke to were interested in the second conversation about God. They redid the research just last year, and now, after one conversation with a Christian, 1 in 3 people are up for another conversation. So what we're finding actually is, once those kind of trappings of religion and religiosity in the public space kind of fall away, there is actually a longing. People are saying, why do I believe what I do? And it's some of those arguments for human dignity, for justice, for what's right. We've got a whole generation now rising up who really care and are arguably more kind of morally motivated than previous generations. And they're looking for a grounding to that. And they're open to exploring Christianity. And so one of the things we're finding is that there's this openness is something that we need to be ready to speak into in a way that connects really deep with people. And just one final thing. The other thing that the Evangelical Alliance found out as they went around churches, as they spoke to those who didn't believe, was how few non-Christians had a Christian friend who they could have that conversation with.
Wow. Mark, let me add a footnote to what Charlie just said. This is similar in Israel. The surveys done in the last 20, 30 years have noted that with the post-Holocaust generation pretty well gone now, there's much greater openness to talking about Jesus or becoming a Christian, or it's Christians who are Jews. That's cool, that's not a big problem. And that's an interesting shift. It's very similar to what Charlie was just saying about the UK.
Yeah, so I spend a lot of time with people who are Jewish, and a substantial number of people who are Jewish who don't necessarily even believe God exists. They're Jewish by heritage, I guess, genetically Jews. And I was talking to one of them recently who's fairly active in his synagogue, and I referenced somebody who was a Messianic Jew. And his reply was, well, that's impossible. And I said, well, no, I mean, they're Jewish. They've got the DNA. They've just decided that Jesus was the Messiah. He said, well, once they made that decision, they're no longer Jews. And I said, but didn't you tell me your father doesn't even believe in God, and you'll call him a Jew? And he said, well, he's Jewish. He just doesn't know that God exists. I said, but if someone knows God exists and just thinks that Jesus is the Messiah, they lose their Judaism? He says, absolutely. And that's actually in my next book that's coming out, World Religions on Trial, which, stay tuned, is out in a couple of months. But
if I could just add one thing, I think we can look at statistics of what people believe. We can look at the kind of state and openness to Christian things. But I do think one of the key questions we need to be asking is about the health of the church. Are we passionately committed to Jesus? When you look back at the earliest Christians, there were a handful of them. There were eventually a few hundred, but they were completely 100% in with Jesus. They were filled with the Spirit, and they said, we cannot but speak of what we've seen and heard. And I wonder if that's something we could say honestly as churches today.
Which is going to be the last question that I give y'all. But before I do that, Craig, talk to us about France and just the whole international European community that you're intimate with from your teaching.
First, I want to say something that I think needs to be said about the presentation of the gospel. As much as it is utterly biblical to live a consistent life with what Christ calls us to do, we don't. We are simul justus et peccator till we die. We are simultaneously sinful and justified before to the day we die and are transformed to go live with the Lord. So presenting your life as the gospel is the ultimate inverted heresy. That is not the gospel. The gospel is extra nos, said Luther, totally outside of ourselves. It happened whether anyone acknowledges it ever. It's a fact. And our gospel presentation needs to stay with the person and work of Christ. Because the moment it's about you and your consistent lifestyle, I got news for you. The Lord doesn't put up with that. Shows your neighbor what a loser you are. Not just a loser, evil. You know how evil you are. I know how evil you are. Speak for yourself. But the Lord has a way of putting us in our place when we start talking about what a great lifestyle we have. We lose to the Mormons 10-0. Okay, second point, France. The only apologetics academy for laity that is done for an extended period of time, 12 days in Strasbourg, France, is the International Academy of Apologetics that John Montgomery, who spoke last year, who the lectureship is sponsored for, who donated his small personal library of merely 30,000 volumes to this place when he goes to his great reward. He is the director. I'm the United States director, and we have 20 spots each summer where we teach 10 classes and bring in the other two best, we think, apologetics professors in the country. This next year, it'll be Paul Copan and Angus Manouge. And we talk about scientific apologetics, legal apologetics, biblical reliability, literary apologetics, world religions. We have courses on those through the 12 days. Plus, it's in the glorious French Rhineland, where you get to drink Alsatian wine. I'm not supposed to say that here, but you get to do that as much as your heart desires. The food is fantastic, but the study is great. Who goes to this? We've had undergraduates sitting next to a housewife from Jamaica, next to a brain surgeon from Singapore, next to 5 pastors, Pentecostal, Lutheran. That's always fun to get a Lutheran with a Pentecostal. That's a train wreck waiting to happen. But the goal is these people are united by their love for the truth of Christianity. That's what unites them, not some false narrative about race or color or age. I hate the segmentation of the church into age groups. Hate it, hate it, hate it. Unify over the truth. That's what we get 20 people to Strasbourg for. So what you can do is go to the website, check it out, International Academy of Apologetics, and think about coming. Usually people wait a couple years, they think about it, say, I'd like to go to that. We fill up very quickly. We've got a few spaces left for next year, but we'd love to have you join us. That's it.
All right, I want to rejoin on one thing you said, and then I want someone else to rejoin on something else that you said. I love the perspective of the gospel being outside of us. Yeah. Drew Davis, there's Drew. Drew and I had one of our Greek professors, Harvey Floyd, who has spoken here. We've got a Harvey Floyd recipient. Yeah, there you are, Preston. One of the things, when class in one of my classes with Dr. Floyd, one of the students said to him, Dr. Floyd, would you please tell us about the day you got saved? And he said, I would love to. And he took his glasses off and he said, it was almost 2,000 years ago on a hill outside of Jerusalem.
Right on.
And proceeded to tell us about the day he got saved. And it was incredible, because there's no question but that there's a finished work. And there's no question we are at the same time sinners and saved. But there is also a recognition that there is a transformation that's going on in us. where there is an evidence of God at work in us, because I'm not the same person that I was 10 years ago, and my wife is so thankful for that. And she is hopeful that I will be a different person in 10 more years, and that is a testimony to the transforming power of God's Spirit. It is something that causes people, I think, to look at the church, hopefully, and say, what is it about you that's different than everybody else that I know? And it's not that we are anything, it's that God is at work in our lives and God is real. And so that might be my little rejoinder. But there is still an issue. I want because Pastor Jared, are you still in here? There you are. Pastor Jared's got us really tuned in on this right now at church, and he sent around 9 prayers for us to be praying by name, our neighbors. He expects us to go out there and know our neighbors by name. Pastor David, where are you? Pastor David, 10 years ago, passed out cards at church and said, write down the name of someone on this card and commit to praying for them. And it took 10 years for this fella to find the Lord that I was praying for. And I found that card in my pocket, wearing the same suit coat 10 years later, and realized the power of prayer. But we are praying people, a bunch of us. And so we know how to pray, Kristen, for your ministry and how we might be able to help. Darrell, we've heard your plea for how we live. Charlie, you've given us good insight. Craig, I'm sitting here thinking, gee, are we even allowed to church plant in Canada? What can we do? And I love what you're doing in Stroudsburg, but we do have Charles Cross here, so I'm going to turn this mic on. Travis, have you turn this on. Charles, tell us the obstacles to faith and how stark it is in France, because you served there as a missionary for a long time. What are the obstacles to believing?
Thank you. One of the things that I thought of when Charlie mentioned post-Christianity, is they also talk about post-secularism, and that today it's gone so far that people are done with secularism and they're looking for something spiritual. But one of the things that we saw frequently was, that is so great that you can have faith. I could never have faith, but you can. And it's like, no, that comes from God. And that's something that we're all given to. And so there was an openness to be willing to listen, but that's not going to engage me personally. So it was being able to show that God has done something in my life personally, but then also bringing the message, the words of the gospel to them at times. And it's difficult because there wasn't always an openness to listen to that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. And while I'm just wandering the halls, if you will, I'm going to ask my dear friend Rhonda Lowry to stand up, because I found out Randy always makes her say things with no warning. Rhonda really was tuned in. Rhonda, can you just loop around this way so everybody can see you, please? Rhonda was really tuned into this from a college perspective, because she was head of spiritual development at Lipscomb University, which is an alma mater for a number of us in here. And so you've seen it from a college student's perspective of how to grow, how to spiritual formation. You've seen the issues that college students address. Would you just give us an idea of where you see the problems with these college students and what you see to be the faith solution that's working for them? And thank you.
Someone said it earlier that the number one characteristic in the culture they were talking about was authenticity and tolerance. And that is what we're finding on our college campuses. It's got to be a culture of tolerance and authenticity. I can sit all day and I can talk about the greatest thinkers in the world. And I can talk to my students about what Ian Bounds has said about prayer. But until my students can look me in the face and say to me, and I know it's not about me, but they're not going to believe or have conversation with me about faith and listen to me until they see me as an authentic person. And I think students today, we're in a culture where apologetics has been pretty much a cognitive experience. And God did not make us as only cognitive people. He gave us a head, but he also gave us a heart. And he made our emotions every bit as much as he made our head, so that we would seek him, we would search for him, and we would find him. He also gave us our existential being, and he also gave us a behavioral being. And psychology, when the psychologists finally started talking to the theologians, we learned a lot. Because it really does make a difference when we take all of who we are as humans and we begin to seek God. It's not just a head trip. It's our heart, it's our hands, it's our head, and it's our being. And that's what our students are looking for today.
Thank you. So I'm going to close this out here briefly, but I want us, and Jared, I know you're going to start or do our prayer tomorrow night, but I want you to come up here and pray for our efforts on all of this, and pray for the kingdom and pray for faith. But in the process of him coming up here, I hope that this has blessed you, but I really hope you'll either come back tomorrow night for my lecture, or you'll tune in on the internet for my lecture, because my lecture's different than the book. I wrote the book. You can read the book. You don't need me to read it to you. My lecture takes from the book, but it takes from a number of different areas to give a message that is very fresh and new in a sense, but jumps off of a lot of what was said, including what Rhonda just gave, which is kind of I'm going to be talking some psychology as well as theology and rational deductive reasoning. So I hope you'll come back tomorrow. We're going to close out with a word of prayer, but before the word of prayer, would you join me in thanking all of these people? And my sincere thanks to each of you very, very much. And Charlie came over just for this from Oxford, so he wins the I Traveled the Furthest award too. Y'all be sure to come up and visit. These are people who've thought this stuff through, and you need to take advantage of that. Pastor Jared, would you pray for the masses?
I'd love to. Let's bow our heads in prayer together. Father, we are deeply grateful to be able to be here today and think about these things. God, all of us with a desire to know you and for others to come to know you. And Lord, I pray that you would burden our hearts for those who are far from you. And Lord, we know it begins in prayer. Lord, even right now, there are people in our circle of influence, people that we live near, people that we work alongside, people in our own families, that God do not know you as Lord and Savior. And Lord, unless you remove the scales from their eyes, unless you soften their heart, Lord, we know that they perish into a Christless eternity. So God, what we've talked about today is so important. Lord, that our conversation would be seasoned with salt. Lord, that we would be prepared to give in a defense for the hope that is within us, and yet do it with gentleness and respect. God, we want to influence people for good, for you. And so help us to be the salt and light that you've created us to be. And so God, for these men and women up here today who have spoken over us the truth of your word, Lord, I pray that we would take it to heart. And God, as we leave here, we want to leave a changed people. We want to leave on mission for you. Thank you, Lord, for giving us the ministry of reconciliation, and help us go forward, preaching and living out your glorious gospel. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you all.